The Day of Resis by Lillian Francis Mentor. Chapter 2. Into the Heart of Africa. After landing at Zanzibar, the labor of equipment began. Bales of cloth and boxes of wire, innumerable colored beads and trinkets were shipped to Bagamoyo in charge of reliable Zanzibari, the most trustworthy of African carriers. Harry first looked up the reputation of Sadai, the Abyssinian, and finding this to be good, he then went in search of the man himself. He was found on the quay with a lot of natives, and upon Harry telling him what he wanted, he followed him to the hotel. Sadai was a monstrous fellow, standing fully 6.5 feet high, and built like a Hercules. His skin was of a bronze color, smooth and shiny. His eyes were piercing black, his forehead high, and his face above the average in intellect for one of his race. "You remember Mr. Boyd, do you not?" asked Mr. Graham when the hotel had been reached. "Perfectly well," answered the Abyssinian. "And you believe that the mysterious land of On exists?" "I do. I wish to make that belief a certainty. Will you join us and get together a proper number of carriers and natives to ensure comparative safety in making the journey?" "Gladly," said Sadai. "You shall have something more than the usual amount paid for such services, for the journey may entail more than the usual amount of work and danger." "I shall expect nothing more than I have been accustomed to getting," answered the Abyssinian. "We will decide on that later," said Mr. Graham. "But tell us now of the finding of the goatskin." "I will do so," said Sadai. "When on my last expedition far up in the country, I heard this story from the mouth of an old man. It may be false, but I believe it to be true. Saga, that is the name of the old man, said, "One day when I was quite a boy, I was out hunting on the mountainside, and among the undergrowth disclosed a flat stone, which had at some remote period covered an opening about 4 feet square in the side of the mountain. Being curious to know whither the hole led, I entered, but had gone only a short distance when I heard a groan. This scared me, but I determined to learn what it was that had made the noise. I returned to the outside and, procuring a torch, again entered the cave and followed in the direction from which the sound came, and had not gone far when I almost stumbled over the prostrate body of a man. I felt it and found it still warm, but upon close examination found that life was extinct. He was of the white race, but exposure and starvation had tanned and drawn the skin tight over the bones. By his side was a knife, and clutched in his hand was a piece of goatskin, on which he had cut strange characters which I could not decipher. I took the goatskin and never again entered the cave." "This was the old man's story," continued Sadai, "and offering him a piece of cloth for the goatskin, he eagerly accepted it, and I left him." "And you could read it?" asked Mr. Graham. "I was for a time in the service of an Englishman in my own country, and knew some English. I've learned more since, but I could not make out all the letters. With Mr. Boyd's help, however, all was made plain. It is here," and Sadai, saying this, handed the parchment to Mr. Graham. The party gathered around Mr. Graham and examined the goatskin closely. "And the old man never sought to solve the mystery?" said Harry. "So he said," answered Sadai. "This parchment tells us how to leave this strange country when once it is entered," said Mr. Graham, "but it does not tell how to find the secret door which is to admit us." "The sailor found it," said Enola, "and it seems to me that we ought to." "Well, we will never know until we get to the point where we may expect to find it," said Mr. Graham. "How far is it, Sadai, to this mountain through which we will have to go to find the strange country?" "About 300 miles, said Sadai, "through a country not difficult to travel, and among natives not usually hostile." "Can you be ready to start tomorrow?" asked Mr. Graham of Sadai. "I can," said Sadai. "Then be at Bagamoyo tomorrow at daybreak, ready to start." "I will be there," answered Sadai, and with this he left. That day a Mr. Bruce called on Mr. Graham, making a request to accompany the expedition, and Mr. Graham, having looked up his reference and found that he was a Scotchman of first-class standing both socially and financially, he consented to his accompanying them. Later in the day the party crossed over to Bagamoyo, so as to be there for an early start in the morning. Early on the following morning the caravan was drawn up and carefully inspected by Mr. Bruce, Mr. Graham, Harry, and Enola. 20 donkeys and 100 carriers with 1 cart were to transport the goods of barter. A double relay of 6 carriers was detailed to carry each of the sedan chairs of Mrs. Graham and Nellie, after having learned that the country through which they would pass would be open and the tribes not hostile, had decided to accompany the caravan. They were desirous of seeing the strange land and people. Mr. Graham, Mr. Bruce, and Harry had procured horses from an Arab in Bagamoyo, and when the caravan was drawn up, it made an imposing sight and one well calculated to inspire hostile tribes with a wholesome fear. At 6 o'clock, with the sun shining brightly, and amid the shouts of many Arabs and natives who had assembled to see them depart, the caravan moved slowly out of Bagamoyo. The American flag was unfurled and floated merrily in the breeze at the head of the column. Out through a narrow lane they passed, the sun speeding to the west, beckoning them on. Loveliness glowed around them, the fertile fields, rich vegetation, strange trees bordering their path, the jubilant sounds of many insects, the cry of cricket and peewit, all seemed to tell them that they had started. The first camp was only 5 miles distant, and the next few days were spent in completing the preparations for their long land journey. After all was in readiness, the caravan again started. From here the roads were mere footpaths leading through fields in which naked women were at work, who looked up and giggled as they passed. Passing on, they entered an open forest. Reaching the Kingimi, they passed over a bridge of felled trees made by some previous party. Harry came to the side of Enola's chair and laughingly said, "One would think from the half-set expression in your eyes that you were already regretting having taken this trip. You are mistaken, Harry. I was simply lost in admiration of the beautiful scene about us." "Yes, it is beautiful," said Harry, "but it is so different from what I have been used to that I often find myself thinking or wondering if it is not all a dream, and if I will not wake up some morning in my room at home and find that I have only visited these lands in my dreams." "Yes, it is decidedly out of the ordinary," laughed Enola, as she saw the serious look in Harry's face. "But if you were as well read in African history and lore of the people as I am, you would accept all this as genuine at once. Listen. For centuries Africa has been known as the Dark Continent. The edges of this immense tract have been known as far back as history goes. Egypt on the north is the oldest government on earth, while the nations bordering on the Mediterranean and Red Seas were actors in the earliest recorded histories. Still, Africa today is an unknown land. That Africa was a rich country was proven by the treasures brought from the interior by the rivers Nile, Niger, and Congo. That it was populous was demonstrated by the millions of slaves furnished by the native tribes to the outside world. For curiosity alone, explorations were made in the early part of the century, but it remained with Livingstone to first open up the Dark Continent, and with Stanley to pierce its very heart. Africa is today, however, a mystery which, it seems, will never be penetrated. Strange stories come to us of people never seen by white men, of customs foreign to all history, of abandoned cities, of desolated countries. Africa is synonymous with mystery and darkness, and nothing seems strange to me which is connected with it." "Such words should be convincing," said Harry, "but my education in life has been too practical to realize that there is so much mystery left in the world in this, the 19th century. It will all be real enough before we get back to civilization, I have an idea," said Enola. "Well, it looks real enough now," said Harry. "This moving caravan, those hippopotami in the river, and the antelope in the forest all scout the idea of there being anything uncanny about our present surroundings." And so days passed, some amid pleasant surroundings, and others in a part of the country not so agreeable. One day they passed through a continuous jungle. The path was only a foot wide, each side being bordered with thorny plants and creepers, the spiky twigs of which were as sharp as needles. The entire party was badly scratched with these irritating twigs, and the caravan was in a sad plight when it reached Msuwa that night. The chief of this tribe was very kind to the tired and wounded party, however, and they remained in this camp 2 days. After leaving here, the country was open and beautiful, presenting a natural park, and the roads were good. They reached the Ungarangari River on the evening of the 24th day, where they encamped, and on the following morning crossed the river and entered the Wakami territory. 5 days later, they reached the Wasagaha district. Here several of the party were stricken with fever, and several days were lost, but all getting better at last. The caravan again moved on. Away off to the north and west could be seen a long range of mountains, in which Sadai informed them was situated the hidden country of On. Shortly after leaving here, they entered a very wild tract. Numberless antelope, springbok, zebra, and giraffes were seen, but upon their approach they would scamper away. Here was a hunter's paradise. What nobleman's reserve in civilization could compare with this vast expanse of field and forest? How small and insignificant would they seem in comparison? The first herd of elephant was also seen here, but they passed them by without disturbing them. That evening they entered the Usugara district, and although the mountains were a considerable number of miles nearer, they still looked just as far away. The atmosphere in this country is so clear it makes distances very deceiving. It was a mountain world which they looked upon, for peak beyond peak, cone beyond cone, fold above fold, they rolled away like so many waves. We shall soon descend into the valley, and across this to those distant mountains directly west of us, at the base of which we shall find the village in which lives the old man of whom I obtained the parchment. We will reach there in 4 marches, said Sadai. And you say there are lions and tigers in the valley? Said Mr. Bruce. Yes, answered Sadai, and this part of the journey will be very dangerous. And this proved to be true, for 2 evenings later, when the supper had been eaten and all had been made snug for the night, Harry and Enola came very near falling victims to one of these ferocious beasts. They had wandered a little distance from the camp, and had sat down on a mossy bank for a few moments' talk before going to bed. They had been here only a short time when they heard a rustle in the bushes, and turning they saw standing not 10 yards away, with his yellow eyes glowing through the semi-darkness, and his long tail swaying from side to side, an immense lion. Harry had not brought his rifle, and they were at the mercy of the beast. The lion seemed to realize this, for he quietly settled down on his haunches and watched them intently. Listen, said Harry, and his lips hardly moved. He will make a leap for us, and when he does, stoop low and run toward him. We will try to pass under him while he is in the air, and before he alights and turns, we may be able to reach camp. I understand, said Enola. The lion again rose to his feet, and then settling on his haunches, prepared to spring. Be ready, said Harry. Now. And he darted forward, but stopped again as soon as he could, for Enola's hand had left his, and she had fallen. There she lay with the lion's paw resting across her breast. Harry could see that she had neither lost consciousness nor presence of mind, for she was gazing steadfastly into the eyes of the huge beast. It was a terrible moment. Harry was afraid to move or cry for help, for fear of the lion seizing Enola and making for the bush. All this time the lion was watching Harry intently, seeming to know that interference would come from that quarter, but he was as powerless to help Enola as if he had been bound hand and foot. He could see that she was becoming weak from terror and loss of blood, and that she could scarcely breathe owing to the weight of that fearful paw on her breast. Her eyes closed several times, and Harry could see that she would soon be unconscious. Something must be done. Would the lion, if he made a rush for him, turn his attention from Enola long enough for her to get out of reach? It mattered little what became of himself if he could but save Enola. Harry seized a short piece of wood lying near him and made a rush for the lion. The lion raised on his haunches as Harry struck him a powerful blow between the eyes. Roll out of the way, said Harry. Enola rolled over once and then staggered to her feet, but sank down again, too weak to move farther. The lion was dazed for an instant by the blow, but only for an instant, and with a lightning stroke of the paw, struck Harry on the shoulder, knocking him senseless and bleeding on the ground. Help! Cried Enola, but the sound was so faint that she despaired of its reaching the camp. Nevertheless, it was heard, and the commotion caused the lion to turn to see what was happening. That look was his death warrant, for a bullet struck him squarely in the eye, and he rolled over with scarcely a groan, dead. One paw was lying across Harry's neck, as though defying them even in death to take his prey from him. Mr. Bruce rushed up, gun in hand, and with several of the carriers bore Enola and Harry to the camp. Restoratives were administered, and Enola soon regained consciousness, but Harry lay in a stupor for hours. Both were badly torn by the claws of the lion, and it was several days before the caravan could move on. The journey from here on was through an open forest. watered by numerous streams which sprung from the mountains. Their progress was somewhat impeded by these streams, but 2 evenings later they camped near the village in which dwelt the old man, who was going to show them the entrance to the cave. Was he still alive, and would they find him? End of section 2.